ReZero Starting Life in Another World, Volume X1, The Dream of the Lion King. Now that's a mouthful. At this point, it's just the entire synopsis on the title, isn't it? This is the second cover we have with Crush and fairies, and this one to me is considerably worse. I like the color scheme, I like the contrast between the red of the fiery background and the blue, you get it, as fairies, the blue, the greatest healing, well, whatever, forget it. I think fairies looks pretty cool in this cover, and I also like Fourier dramatically laying in the background, but man, it must be said, what is up with Crush's face? It looks so bad. I was shocked when I realized that it's the same illustrator from the main volumes, and don't get me wrong, he has been prone to make some goofy faces before. The one I criticized the most is Elsa's face in volume 12, but this one just looks very awkward. It doesn't even look like Crush here, it looks like something that's fan-made. So to me, this cover is a mixed bag. It has aspects that have potential, but overall it wasn't very interesting, and to me the cover is a perfect encapsulation of the book itself. Overall, X1 was not quite what I expected, and I will be greatly readjusting my expectations for the X side stories going forward. From this volume, I was expecting to get to know Crush and fairies more, get to know their dynamic, and get to know about the sweet prince that Crush once loved, and we got some of that, at least 3/4 of that. The author somehow managed to keep the book interesting enough for a ReZero reader while disclosing the minimum information possible. I wanted to get to know Crush and Fairies' backstory, mostly their dynamic, how they got to know each other and how they became the way they are, and we touched on that briefly. We teased it many times, but we never really got the specific story. We got to know some interesting details like Fairies' childhood, which I don't remember being explored in much depth in the main story, and we also got the little tease that Fairies' mother may not be his true mother, he may be a bastard son with the maid, but all of this is information which isn't super relevant in the grand scheme of things. The main juice of this is his promise with Crush, which was mentioned various times but never fully disclosed. If you've seen my previous ReZero videos, you know that Crush is one of my favorite characters, so I still enjoy this book because it did provide a little bit more information about her, but if I'm being completely honest, while this book advertises Fairies and Crush, the main character and the central character of the entire thing is Fourier. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, by the way. I just went to the Wikipedia and read the Romaji, and that's how I'm trying to pronounce his name, so hopefully I don't butcher it too much. I am guessing that Crush and Fairies' relationship will be relevant for the main story later on, so there are things that are kept untold in this side story. The same, however, does not apply to Fourier, who can be fully explored without reservations, because unless there's some other necromancy shenanigans going on, he will not be returning to the main story, so that makes him the most interesting character in this book. We see Fourier's highs and lows, we see his entire life quite literally ever since he was a child until he passes away in the final chapter, and we see how he impacts the characters around him. I think the author did a very good job at implying that he's related to Felt, as there's that certain brattiness, that certain weird charisma that they both have, while never explicitly stating it. As far as monarchs go, and keep in mind up until volume 21 we haven't actually seen any monarchs in the main story unless I'm forgetting somebody, Fourier is very casual, very not formal, and it makes him a very interesting character because of this dichotomy. He's the fourth son, so he is still a very important person, but he doesn't feel or present himself as someone that's very important. From the casual conversation to his actions, it's very easy to imagine how he would get along with Subaru and the rest of the gang if he only had lived a few years longer. And I'd imagine that he would have a very funny relationship with Felt, where deep down they would love each other, but they would bicker and banter all the time and give us all of these comedic moments. As far as the book structure goes, it's comprised of 5 chapters, chronologically ordered, where we skip a few years on every chapter and we start with them as children and end with Fourier passing away. The book starts out with some comedy, spices it up with some action scenes, and then ends with the author pulling at your heartstrings. I will say that I enjoyed the first and last chapters the most. I think the author does a good job at depicting the awkwardness and naivety of 2 children meeting and wanting to be friends. I think that was written quite well. And I loved the final chapter. To me, it was my favorite chapter and the entire reason that I still think that it's worth reading this book. We didn't know Fourier for long, but to me it was still enough to empathize with him as a character. Because this book is written without any reservations about Fourier's character, much like the character itself, we get to know him pretty well throughout, where his end, even if it was already known by the reader, it's still pretty tragic. Much like Ferris's subplot of feeling powerlessness, of not being able to do anything for the ones you love, this final chapter is written with the tragedy of disease, something that none of us can really fight. So it's a very human chapter, even though ReZero has all of these mystical elements and just one chapter before we were fighting zombies in the middle of a fire. Here this chapter feels very human and it's a delicacy to read, even if it's quite tragic and quite a sad ending to a supposedly happy side story. Who am I kidding? It's a ReZero side story, obviously it wouldn't be happy. And it doesn't end there. The volume ends with Krush being recognized as one of the royal candidates, knighting fairies, and having a very determined and resolute ending of achieving the dream of the Lion King. So as sad of an ending as it may have been, it's still an ending that has a message of hope and determination, something that I think fits Krush's character very well. As far as the middle chapters go, I was much more interested in the character moments than necessarily in the fighting scenes, but then again, this is a side story, so you read it for more information about the characters you already love, not necessarily for a nice action sequence. I will say though, and it's one of my biggest disappointments in this volume, that the fight with Ousagi got off screen. I was so bummed about that. According to the author in the afterword, he was still in the process of writing volume 7 around this time, so we're still a long ways away of meeting the Great Rabbit in arc 4, but still making the entire fight completely off screen felt like such a waste. I can think of two reasons for this. Either the author had already planned the Ousagi but didn't quite know how it was going to be portrayed, so he preferred to leave it at that. Or he already knew how the Ousagi was going to be but didn't want to ruin the surprise for arc 4. I think it's pretty obvious that the author of ReZero plans a lot of things in advance, and perhaps he doesn't have the full details planned out, but I think it's very clear that he has a lot of the story already structured, so I think he already knew how the Ousagi was going to be. So I think it was just a matter of not wanting to ruin the surprise for arc 4 perhaps, but it makes this book really age badly, which I think is very weird to say about a side story, but I really wanted to see Krush interact with the Ousagi and how she would defeat it. Apparently she just chased it away, which I didn't even know was an option. I guess she's very fit to fight the Ousagi as she has an AoE attack, which is much more mana efficient than Emilia's icicles, for example, but still it feels like a bit of a cop-out. In arc 4 we had this incredible conjunction of magic with Emilia jailing the rabbit and then Beatrice doing some forbidden dark magic to send it to another dimension, and here Krush is off the party, then she comes back, oh yeah, by the way, I just chased away the Ousagi, and as if it's something super casual, it seemed a bit weird. Then again, this was one of the many things that I carelessly spoiled on Wikipedia while doing research for these videos, so perhaps it was my own fault for raising my expectations too high. I was expecting an epic battle and I got nothing. Overall, X1 was decent for world building, which I guess is the entire point of the X volumes, but wasn't really a masterpiece. As I've already said, it definitely helps getting some new pieces of the puzzle as far as fairies and Krush go, but it doesn't explain the most important thing, which is the promise between those two and how Krush really affected Ferris's childhood. This book is, to me, a Fourier side story, which perhaps you like him as a character, but if you don't, there's not really much value here. The main story will likely revisit the Krush and Ferris dynamic, as I believe it will be relevant later on, and besides some miscellaneous world building or Fourier as a character or Priscilla Bariel's ex-husband who appears and is mega suspicious by the way, there's not really something in this book that I would say is unskippable. This book is roughly the same size as a normal ReZero volume, and in my opinion there's just not much juice in it. So if you skip this one, I don't think you will skip much, but then again, if you're watching this video, you've likely already read this book and you're a hardcore ReZero fan who will likely read everything ReZero does, so I guess this is useless advice. Leave it in the comments below if I'm being too harsh. To me, I liked it because I like Krush as a character and I wanted to get to know more about Fourier, but on the grand scheme of things, I would say this one is entirely skippable and not super relevant to the main story. And this was it for me today, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this more unorganized style. This video is a lot more off the cuff. I didn't have as many notes as I usually do. I just finished reading this book a few hours ago and I will be leaving in a few hours. So hopefully you enjoyed this. We'll see how it does, and I will see you guys on the next video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and bye bye.